Hello and welcome back to That Gut Feeling, Doing It for the Kids. I'm super excited about our guest today, Delia McCabe. And the reason for that is because prior to being an accountant, I actually wanted to be a psychologist. And I did actually start studying psychology at one point. And then after finishing accounting, I wanted to get into the neuroscience side of things. And our guest today has dipped her toes into both of those areas. So I'm super excited about picking your brain, Delia. Before we get started, I'll just read a quick bio for our listeners. So Delia shifted her research focus from clinical psychology to nutritional neuroscience upon discovering nutrition's critical role in mental well-being. Her research has been published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, and she is a regular featured expert in the media. Delia has written 2 internationally available books, which are available in 4 languages. Using her background in psychology combined with evidence-based nutritional neuroscience and neurological strategies, Delia supports behavior changes and stress resilience within corporates, and for individuals who want to optimize their brain health via workshops and tailored events internationally. Wow, that's some bio. Thank you so much for jumping on today.
Hi, Tony. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm delighted.
Excellent. Now, Delia, I was really excited when I listened to your story, and so much so that we were actually meant to catch up at another point to discuss whether or not we'd be a good fit for one another. And I'd actually taken it into my own hands to decide that you were in fact a good fit for me, and we didn't really necessarily need that appointment, but here you are. Now, would you mind sharing with our listeners where you've come from and where you are now and what it is that you're doing?
Well, to cut a long story short, like you, I wanted to be a psychologist and I went down that path. But, as fate would have it, things change, and it changed just because of one question. So I had this group of really smart school kids that were really battling to do well at school. These were kids that should have been getting A pluses and they were failing. And I decided to find out what the psychological variables were related to this underachievement. So I had my experimental group, those are the kids doing poorly but smart, and I had my control group, the smart kids who were doing well, and I decided to just ask them one question because I had a little bit of space on one of the questionnaires that I developed. And the question was, what is your favorite food? And that's such a simple question, and it changed my whole destiny because every one of the children in my experimental group, that's the really smart kids who were doing poorly, every one of those kids loved junk food. And in the other group, the group that was smart and doing well, they liked Sunday roast and, baked potatoes and veggies and so on. They didn't love junk food. And I was like, wow, very seldom in research do you find such a clear distinction. But I had a real problem because then I couldn't write it up in my master's thesis because that wasn't what my protocol was. My protocol was looking at the psychological variables related to the underachievement. So then I was stuck and I thought, well, what am I going to do? And so fate had stepped in a second time because I was pregnant with my first child and I was just about to give birth to her. And I thought, well, it's stupid for me to just start in the psychotherapy field right now. Let me take a little bit of time and investigate what this all means about the food. So you can see me there, heavily pregnant, going to the university, digging on the shelves, speaking to the librarians, where were these journal articles? And, this was before the internet. So I'm really dating myself now because I couldn't just Google it. I had to go and search and figure out what on earth this thing was about brain function and nutrition. And so I stumbled across a few people who were tentatively dipping their toes into this fascinating field. And I thought, well, I really need to immerse myself in this. And 25 years later, my daughter's now 25 and I never became a psychotherapist. I just couldn't endure talking to people about their trauma when I wanted to say to them, hey, what did you have for breakfast?
Yeah.
So it shifted my entire way of thinking. So in a nutshell, that's what happened, Tony.
Wow, that is so interesting. And, I see it a lot even with my own boy, I notice, my eldest that is, I notice that food affects his mood and his behavior like on a whole nother level. It really is intense, isn't it?
It really is intense. And I think one of the challenges we've had as researchers is it's not ethical to deprive people of nutrients to be able to see what the effects are. So
Mm,
when we do research, we can't do the golden standard, research of double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center studies. We can't do that. It's not ethical. So we have to look at observational studies. We have to look at what happens to people if they've eaten a certain food or certain food patterns over long periods of time. And so there are a lot of other variables that come into play in those kinds of studies. So it's very difficult to say, cause and effect, but anybody that's a mum or a dad and they look at their kids and they've been to a birthday party and they're high on colors and flavors and sugar, they'll know that those children behave differently and they sleep differently and they feel differently. So those are what we call case studies, and we are all masters of that if we parents.
yeah, absolutely. So I was talking to a girlfriend the other day, and she was telling me about the fact that she just has absolutely horrendous sleep. And on top of that, she's going to the cupboard and she's pulling out, all of the foods that she shouldn't be. Cakes, biscuits, those kinds of things. On top of that, she's having a fair bit of anxiety as well. And she said to me, I don't know whether it's the whole chicken and egg situation where she doesn't know what comes first, whether it's the food that she's eating that's throwing everything out, or is it because she's stressed out of her brain and not sleeping. Do you have any kind of take on that at all?
Yeah, look, this is a very interesting discussion and an interesting dilemma. And I suppose I shouldn't use the word interesting, I should say really challenging obstacle, because there are a number of different factors that feed into the sleep challenge. So let's start with the first one. Let's just talk about neurotransmitters and hormones. And once we've got that under the belt, we can move on to the next stage. So one of the things that long ago researchers used to believe that women were a little bit funny in the head because we would behave erratically at certain times of the month. And you find an insensitive man that will say that today still. He'll say, oh, well, it must be that time of the month. And of course, we want to strangle them. But there is, as they say, where there is smoke, there's fire. And there is really truth in this. And I'll tell you why. And it's not bad and it's not a disaster. In fact, many times there is research to show that women are much more creative at that time of the month. So this is how it works. We have hormones that fluctuate regularly during the month. And these hormones are primarily estrogen and progesterone. Now, men don't have that because they don't have cycles. So we have these hormones that fluctuate, and it's nature's way of making sure that we can procreate. The challenge is that those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are linked to neurotransmitters. So when our estrogen peaks and troughs, it impacts serotonin. So serotonin also peaks and troughs. Now, serotonin is a very important neurotransmitter, and most people know it's related to sleep. It helps us feel safe and secure. It helps us feel calm, and it helps us feel as if everything's under control. The thing about serotonin that most people don't know is that serotonin also codes for anxiety. So we have some serotonin receptors that code for calming us down, and we have some serotonin receptors that calm for increasing our anxiety. And we don't know how these necessarily feature in our own lives because there are genetic factors that impact serotonin synthesis and prevalence of these receptors. So that's the one side of the conversation, how estrogen and serotonin are impacted. Now, progesterone and GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, are the two that are linked together. Now, GABA is a neurotransmitter that helps us feel calm, it helps us feel relaxed, it helps us feel in control. And we need both serotonin and GABA in varying quantities to be able to help us feel as if we're in control and as if life is manageable. And of course, also to give us a bit of an up sometimes to be anxious about the things that we should be anxious about. So it's a beautiful balancing act, and these hormones and these neurotransmitters work in concert. The challenge is that when our hormones are out of sync, which happens when we're stressed, This naturally directly impacts serotonin synthesis and GABA synthesis. And then this goes out of whack. And so we find ourselves feeling very emotional. We find ourselves feeling like attacking that box of chocolates with a vengeance and finishing it off in 5 minutes, because serotonin is related to appetite regulation and satiation. So we then see that the hormones are directly related to what we have the desire to eat. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, with the way we live in this world today, which is really a complex world that we've created for ourselves, we've increased our stress levels significantly, and stress impacts both the hormones and their synthesis and the neurotransmitters separately. And then you combine them with stress and you have what you call a perfect storm. So that's the first part of the conversation. If your client's hormones are unbalanced, it's directly going to impact serotonin and GABA, and that will immediately affect her sleep and her appetite. Mm-hmm. Now we move on to the second stage, about the gut. Now we'll talk about the gut in more detail later, but the thing about the gut, which is important to keep in mind, is that 80% plus of serotonin is produced in the gut. Now we call this peripheral serotonin. This is different to the serotonin that's produced in the brain. If the gut is not functioning optimally for a number of reasons, which we will get back to, then serotonin synthesis is impacted. So once again, your client could, just because of gut challenges, be having a problem with serotonin synthesis, which is then impacting her sleep, because serotonin is the foundation of melatonin. So that's that side of it. When we look at how this all works together, we know without a shadow of a doubt that women experience stress differently to men. So if your client is stressed, apart from the hormone issues, we can't really put them apart, but let's just put them aside for argument's sake. If she's very stressed at the moment, this means that the part of her brain that regulates emotion, which is the limbic system, is much more active because she's a woman versus the case if she was a man. So we know that the limbic system becomes very activated, and that of course is related to mood, it's related to emotional regulation, it's related to stress response, it's related to fear, excitement, and a whole lot of other things. So stress will also be impacting her and negatively affecting the way she craves food, the way she sleeps. So those are factors that we have to take into account and look at them. And, you know, as you said, is it the chicken and the egg? So it's really impossible to tease it apart. Because we can't say to her, okay, you have to be without hormones for a while so we can see if it's just your gut, because it doesn't work that way. Yeah. So we have to then look at the easiest and fastest way. It's kind of like a cruel twist of fate, because the good news is if you change one thing, it can have a positive, negative effect. But the other side is if you change one thing negatively, it can have the opposite. So the first thing for her to do, and the easiest thing for her to do, which may not feel easy because she's craving those chocolates and you know those biscuits, she should definitely look at eating the kinds of food that's going to change her gut bacteria, because that's the second thing that we need to discuss, the gut bacteria in relation to serotonin synthesis, and then of course the domino effect onto neurotransmitters. So that's a start for your client in relation to how everything fits together. And I mean, you may not want to explain that all to her, but at least the listeners and the viewers can get an idea. This is a complex issue. It's complex because of the interaction and the relationship between the neurotransmitters and the hormones, and that this is going on continuously. And this is why, you know, PMT, I put a video up the other day on Facebook, and I spoke about a comedian, Roseanne Barr, and she said PMT allows her to be who she really is. And I had to laugh at that because, you know, when women are experiencing a hormonal shift or a high or a low, they feel like everything that they say is 100% true and that they need to say it. And we can all relate to that. Yes. But that's just because our brain isn't good at monitoring us during that time and helping us to just maybe not say the thing that we want to say.
I need a bit of that filter in my life a little bit more often, I think. Or my husband probably thinks that more than what I do, but okay. So when, you know, reaching for those chocolates and those biscuits and everything else, they're going to throw out the gut microbiome as well. And it's going to have that vicious cycle then, isn't it? Because then you've got what's going on in the brain. I'm certainly no expert. Maybe you can elaborate on this for us. The whole addiction to sugar and everything else that goes with it too. So it's a really hard cycle to break, isn't it? I know personally for myself, once I had both of my boys, and I talk about this quite openly on both of my social media accounts, after I had both my boys, and now that you're saying all this about hormones, I was always thinking it was the lack of sleep that was driving the sugar cravings. But again, perfect storm. All of the antibiotics that I was on, because I had emergency cesarean, so that would have been throwing things out. The hormones associated with childbirth, the lack of sleep due to getting up to bub in the middle of the night, and my body obviously needing that energy hit. So I was going to, I've always been really good with my willpower and not going down that road. I'd have treats every now and then for sure, but it was like I had no control on what was going on. I'd be reaching for the chocolates and going, no, Tony, no, Tony, no, Tony, lifting it to my mouth. No, Tony, put the chocolate down, and in it would go.
Look, it's a huge challenge. And I think that part of the problem is that it is the chicken and egg. Where do you start? Because sleep impacts hormonal synthesis. It impacts neurotransmitter synthesis and functioning. And then the lack of sleep makes you crave more food because you have a lack of energy. So we do have this vicious cycle that, that goes on and on. And then of course we have the feeling that, we're actually having a tough time and we don't want to deprive ourselves. And that's a very psychological angle to the whole thing, because we feel like we're exhausted. We feel like we're not having many treats. We feel like our children are waking us up all night. And so we feel, what's one more chocolate actually going to do? Nothing. And a couple of months later, we wake up and we realize it actually did a lot. It all landed on our thighs or whatever, and affects our sleep. So there are a number of ramifications to this perfect storm, as we're calling it. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the gut is very, very sensitive, both to external environment, so that's the stress that we're experiencing, and to the food that we're consuming. So a really simple thing to do is to just make sure that the food you eat is of a very high quality. And that doesn't mean that you can't eat chocolate, but if you're going to eat chocolate, eat organic chocolate, 70% plus, and dip that melted chocolate into pieces of ripe pear, for example, so that you're getting some great nutrients with that treat. Because otherwise that feeling of deprivation really drives us. And this is where I realized that my psychology training wasn't really such a waste, because I can put on my psychology hat and I can say, look, it's not that easy to change habits, but if we replace them with something really yummy and delicious, then it becomes a lot simpler. Then it's not just a matter of I'm depriving myself and I have to eat a carrot stick. That's not the aim of the exercise. We can deal with the psychology of creating a new habit, which is actually not that hard when you focus on pleasure. And then in the same breath, we're dealing with building a new neural pathway. And in the same breath, we're creating a foundation for shifting our thinking about food. And in the same breath, we're providing the nutrients, which is allowing our brain to function more efficiently, which means it'll make those neurotransmitters with greater ease and support our gut health. Because when our gut health becomes out of sync, and I think a lot of people have become very aware of the fact now, because the media speaks a lot more about gut health and brain health and how they're intimately interlinked. The challenge is that most people don't understand how this happens. They just know that it does. And a very simple example is explaining to people that we're supposed to have 4,000 different kinds of gut bacteria, firstly, and most of us do not have any close to that. However, most people today, because of processed food and because of high stress levels, have more of a gut bacteria that is super, super efficient at extracting calories. Now, this is good news if we don't have too many of them, because we do need to extract calories. Otherwise, we have no energy to function. But if we have more of those than the ones that are related to lean bodies that aren't that efficient, we end up craving, firstly, the foods that feed those highly efficient calorie extracting bacteria. And secondly, more of them proliferate so that our gut lining becomes impacted. And this is really where the secret is. When gut lining is impacted, and you know this, Tony, because of the research that you've done, when the gut lining is impacted, those very, very sophisticated and sensitive cells become damaged, and they become very inefficient at stopping food particles and other toxins from entering the bloodstream. And then once they've entered the bloodstream, we have this terrible storm of inflammation that happens, and those inflammatory compounds travel all the way to the brain, And this is where the challenge comes in. The blood-brain barrier is just as sensitive as the gut barrier, or the gut lining, to damage from inflammatory compounds. So it becomes damaged, it opens up, and then those toxic compounds are allowed into the brain. And that's how the gut and the brain are intimately linked. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to do is to ensure that you start consuming the kinds of foods that allow the good bacteria to proliferate, because they make sure that they produce tiny compounds that keep that gut lining really strong, heal it, keep it strong, and provide a good mucosal lining to the gut, so that it is very capable of keeping the bad compounds and not properly digested food particles from entering the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. It sounds like such a long comment that I made. But.
No, I appreciate that. And can I just get your take on, so, when I have this conversation with my husband, for example, about, so my eldest has had eczema in the past. We've managed to do some things to help improve his gut health, and over time, every now and then that all slips and he might have like a breakout or whatnot. And I explained to him about the compromise in the gut lining and leaky gut and all of that, and I explain about the elimination diet and how it's important to remove foods that are harming and replenish with what is healing. And that's why foods that may not necessarily have been a problem for people in the past are now not so well tolerated, isn't it? It's because of that wearing down of that gut lining.
Absolutely. That's why with age, food intolerances become more of a challenge. And also when children go into puberty, because when they step into puberty, two things happen. They change their diet because they're associating more with their friends. And the second thing that happens is that a lot of the nutrients in the body are now driven towards hormone synthesis. And so those nutrients are no longer available for all the things that they need to do, including protecting gut lining. So that is definitely the case, that we become a lot more susceptible because of gut lining integrity breakdown. And the primary aim of the exercise is therefore to heal the gut with the kinds of foods that allow the lining to then recuperate and replenish itself. And it isn't as hard as people think, because there's research to show that in as little as 4 days, good bacteria can start proliferating again. And that's really good for people to know, because 4 days is really not a long time at all. And just with a few tweaks and a few changes, they can make those changes happen. And the changes are long reaching. It's not just gut health. It's our weight. It's our desire for processed foods. It's our brain health. A whole lot of very positive spin-off effects happen when we just change the food that we're consuming for gut health.
Okay. So with a lot of people that I come into contact with, these changes, even if they may just sound small, can sometimes be quite overwhelming and quite challenging, I suppose. And as a psychologist, you would understand that as humans, we aren't so very accepting of change, are we? Let me articulate this correctly. So when you're working with someone, do you first focus on getting them to embrace the change? Do you have to work on changing behavioral patterns first? Do you change the food first and then the rest follows? Like what have you noticed in your work?
Well, the first thing that one needs to keep in mind is to not allow deprivation to step in at all, because the minute you feel deprived, you then feel that, life is tough, and then you get sorry for yourself, and then you think it's not really fair, and so on and so forth. And we used to say in our family, then you start suffering from plum. That's poor little old me. And we don't want anyone to experience that. So it definitely makes sense to never suffer from deprivation. So I speak about replacement foods. Instead of consuming that, you're going to consume this. It may taste a little bit different, but you're not cutting it out entirely. So for example, and you will probably know this with working with clients with gluten-free food, the minute you say to them, you can't eat bread anymore, they become hysterical because they love bread. Yes. And it's probably one of the main reasons that they've got a problem, because they love.
That's what I was talking about before.
So then, of course, one has to address that issue and say, well, look, we're not going to take bread away. We're going to just give you a different kind of bread, and it tastes really good. It doesn't taste exactly the same, But after a couple of days, it's going to be fine. And you don't make too many changes at once. That's the second thing, because the minute you make too many changes, that becomes overwhelming. And as you said, we don't like to change our patterns of behavior. So definitely no deprivation, firstly. Secondly, just replacement with as simple and as similar as possible. And thirdly, not too many changes at once, because the minute you do that, people just go, no, this is too much. And sometimes they say to themselves, it's not actually so bad. The bloating and the belly ache and the weight gain is not so bad. I'd prefer to eat cake. So we need to help them to build a new neural pathway without feeling as if it's too hard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you touched on it a little bit earlier about the brain building new pathways, and that would come into play once you make these changes too, wouldn't it? Because the brain's so, what's the word I'm looking for? The neuroplasticity.
Yes, that's right.
Would you mind?
The brain is neuroplastic. That's the right word. And neuroplasticity is a wonderful thing, but there's a dark side to neuroplasticity. If you start a bad habit, it just as easily becomes entrenched in the brain as when you start a good habit. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about neuroplasticity that most people don't realize is you're not overriding the bad habit with a new one. You're forming a new one. So the bad habit will always be there. So for example, when you talk to people that have smoked for decades and they stop smoking and they stay away from environments where smoke is smelt and they see people smoking, and then they suddenly come to that environment again, they get the desire to pick up a cigarette and smoke it as if it was yesterday, because that neural pathway is still lurking there. It hasn't entirely disappeared and will never, ever disappear, in fact. So we have to create new neural pathways. But the way to make them entrenched is, as I said, just make sure it's not a matter of deprivation. Because the minute a person feels deprived, it's so easy for them to step back into the old neural pathway, because it's waiting there with open arms to say, yeah, come along, let's eat that chocolate together again. Yeah. So we just need to make sure that we create a new one with as much simplicity and ease as possible, so that it can become entrenched over time.
And make it enjoyable as well. Does that matter?
Absolutely.
It has to be a positive. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I mentioned the dark chocolate. When people think that they can't eat chocolate or coffee anymore, they get that terrible feeling of my life is ending. And so I like to explain to them how you can still do those things, but with more intelligence behind it. Let's do it wisely so that we're not undermining our health and so that we're still enjoying, having pleasure. And, you spoke about how people don't like to change their bad habits. My son was diagnosed with gluten insensitivity when he was 5 years old, 5 or 6. I can't remember. He's 22 now. And it was a really sobering experience for us because he was a very good-natured, happy child. And we didn't eat a lot of bread. But when he did, he became cranky and irritable and aggressive. And so I took him for tests, and this is what came out. And I sat down and I explained it to him, and he was really young. And I said, I'll make sure that you're never deprived, ever. I'll make sure that whatever I make for you will be delicious and nobody else will look at you and say, oh, that looks odd and horrible. And we actually had friends in our neighborhood who would come to our house, especially for the gluten-free cake that I used to make Matthew and all the other treats, because that's how I promised him that there would be no deprivation involved. And so that is what's happened over the years. And today he will read labels so carefully. Yeah. He knows gluten doesn't suit you. And one day I asked him about it and he said, Mom, I experience a feeling of such crankiness and such irritability if I do happen to eat something that's got gluten in it, if someone gives something to him or he's not vigilant, which he normally is. He says, I know then that it's the food, because he knows that his temperament isn't that way inclined. Wow. So one of the secrets really is to make sure that there's no deprivation involved. And that's one of the reasons I started my recipe book. I started keeping a list because then I had to give the mums of my son's friends the recipes because those kids wanted to eat those foods. So it was kind of like a very positive spin-on effect, which started out as something really challenging for him.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. Good on you for going to those lengths for your baby. That's a big reason why I have started this podcast, in fact, is just so that I can share stories like yours, and your knowledge is just so incredible. Like, there's so many people out there that can benefit from all of this information. So I thank you very much for that. Now, would you mind sharing with our listeners some tips and tricks that you have found or that you recommend for them to try in healing their gut?
Absolutely, Tony. And it's really a delight to be able to share this, because I really do believe that the ramifications are really long-term for both the mums and the whole family and the children, because the way our children develop their eating habits actually persists for a lifetime. You know, they may change a little bit, but they always come back to the way you taught them. And of course, we're developing a brain in a very vulnerable and specific moment in time that we don't get a chance to do again, because they're windows of opportunity that aren't repeated. So there are a number of really positive spin-on effects when we start doing this. So the first piece of advice that I'd like to give mums and try to get them to get their children to embrace is to chew their food. And this sounds so boring, and it sounds so, you know, like everybody knows we should chew our food, but
I listened to this podcast for this long to hear to chew my food.
Absolutely. And for goodness sake, can't you tell us something else? I'm going to give the most boring one first, and that is chew our food. And so what I'm trying to get people to understand is that they need to eat food that requires chewing. Because if we eat highly processed food, you know, you chew it twice, it becomes mush, and you swallow it. And that obviously doesn't encourage gut integrity and gut health. And it also doesn't encourage the release of the enzymes that are required to enhance digestion. So choose food that does require chewing, like carrot sticks, like cucumber, like, you know, a hard apple for children that can chew that. Get them to dip it into a tahini and maple syrup mixture. And they've got to dip it in, and they lick it off, and they chew it, and they activating their jaw muscles, which also impact tooth development and jaw development and growth. So there's a whole lot of very positive spin-on effects with chewing well. There's even some research to suggest that when we chew, we stimulate blood supply to the brain. So that's another angle that chewing encompasses. Yeah. So make sure we eat food that requires chewing. And one of the challenges with people living on smoothies is that when they live on a smoothie, all they do is glug the nutrients down. And the smoothie can be full of really good things and great nutrients and be very nutrient dense, but you're not getting the maximum benefit or the optimal benefit of those nutrients if you're not chewing. So I just suggest people make a great smoothie and stir into it things that need chewing, like almonds, you know, like maybe some walnuts, like a chopped up apple or a diced up orange or some kiwi fruit, just so that each mouthful requires chewing. So that's
I've got something to add to that, if you don't mind. So I do up smoothie bowls. So I chuck in a heap of ice so it's really nice, thick consistency. And then I crush up some nuts and whatever else I'm feeling like that day, just to give it that crunch at the end of it. I can't drink anything that has anything like seeds or crunch to it. But if I'm using a spoon, as weird as it sounds, yeah, it's really, really good. So that's a good tip there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we need to incorporate this into our eating habits, because really it makes a huge difference. And what you said is exactly spot on. Smoothie bowls are the way to go. The second point will sound counterintuitive. And I know that people that manufacture probiotics are going to be saying, oh, no, you can't be saying that. But the truth of the matter is that probiotics are kind of like a plaster. So when people are consuming probiotics, they're giving themselves the bacteria just for the time that the bacteria can survive as a stopgap. So I suggest that people eat prebiotic foods. So these are the kinds of foods that allow bacteria to proliferate, the ones we want to proliferate. So then you don't have to buy probiotics and use probiotics. You may do that for a period of time while you're trying to heal your gut, and you're also shifting your diet, but you don't have to do it forever, because the prebiotic foods will naturally be producing the kinds of fiber and the kinds of nutrients that the good bacteria love, and they will start thriving, and automatically appetite is enhanced, belly bloat goes down, transit time, which we can chat about in a moment, will also improve. So a whole lot of very positive spin-on effects happen when you start eating prebiotics versus taking a probiotic.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Should I discuss transit time for a second?
Should you discuss what, sorry?
Transit time.
Sure.
That's how long it takes for us to eat the food before the waste product leaves our body.
Okay. Yep.
Now, most people don't want to talk about transit time, but I think that on this podcast, where your focus is on gut health, I think it's allowed, Tony.
Okay.
So let's talk about transit time. Two things about transit time. Firstly, women have a longer transit time than men generally.
Okay.
So that is related to estrogen and serotonin relationship. So that's the first thing. The second thing about transit time is that anything from 12 to 16, 17 hours is the optimal time for food to move from your mouth out in waste form. That's the optimal time. Anything over 20 hours means that it's in there for too long and it starts putrefying. And anything shorter than 12 hours means that it's moving through too quickly and the food is not being absorbed optimally because it's not being able to have contact with the gut lining for long enough. So this is a really complex discussion and topic, but it's important to mention it because transit time definitely influences our overall health and well-being significantly. So the next question that people normally ask me, and I'll preempt you, is how do I know what my transit time is? And there's a magical test to find out what that is. Consume 1 tablespoon of white sesame seeds in a little glass of water.
Okay.
Swallow it and keep checking. And you'll figure out what your transit time is.
Okay.
And that will give you a really good idea as to whether your gut health is optimal or not. And then you'll know that you can tweak it, and that's a trick.
Okay, there you go. So if someone does have a longer transit time or a shorter transit time, would you just then go back to recommending them eating the good prebiotic foods? Or would you then be, sort of saying maybe it's time to consult a professional? What would be your advice to those people?
Well, the first thing that is, if your transit time is too long, then that means you don't have enough fiber in your gut or not enough water. So that's the first thing to up. And when you up the amount of fiber you're consuming, you naturally will up the prebiotics. If you're eating real food, then your prebiotics will be upped. If your transit time is too short, it may mean that you're consuming too much fiber, which would be very, very unusual in our society, but would occur if people are following an extreme diet where maybe they're eating only raw food and their gut integrity is compromised. And so you would try some shifts and changes according to those two areas. And if they don't improve, then it would be time for them to go and see a specialist, because maybe they have some kind of bigger challenge that is causing the transit time to be what it is. So there are definitely shifts that people can make first before they move on to the next step.
Okay.
It's also interesting to know that women also suffer from irritable bowel syndrome more than men. So we know that's related to the way they respond to stress, which is different to the way men respond, and also related to the serotonin, estrogen, and progesterone GABA interactions. So, when women complain about having challenges with their belly, it is definitely much more prevalent among women than it is among men.
There you go. I didn't know that. Actually, there was one more thing that I heard you say on a podcast the other day. I wanted to pick your brain about that, and it's going back to what we were talking about before about habits and forming habits. And you see a lot of advice online about, is it 21 days to break a habit? And you said that that's not actually true.
No, it isn't. It's actually interesting because that habit myth evolved because there was a plastic surgeon who realized when he assessed his patients that it took them 21 days to get used to their new faces. And so he mentioned this to some people in passing, and some of those people being, lifestyle gurus, very famous ones, took it on board as if that meant that it takes 21 days to form a new habit. And it wasn't at all related to a habit formation. It was just related to a perception of one's own being. It wasn't related to a new habit. So when they've done more robust research, they now know that it takes 60 plus days to create a new habit. So people just need to keep that in mind. And if after 21 days they don't feel like, that habit is entrenched already, don't feel bad. Just add a bit more dark chocolate and continue until you get to 60 plus days.
I love that. Now, can you share with our listeners where they can find you? And I'd love to hear more about these books that you've written, and the recipe books sound pretty interesting.
With pleasure, Tony. But before I do that, I want to tell you about the last thing, number 3, that I want the viewers and the listeners to do. No, that's fine. We've had such an interesting conversation and we've discussed so many things. But the last one, interestingly, is about sleep.
Okay.
Now, we kind of like started with sleep, where your client was really battling with sleep, and we discussed all the different, scenarios related to that. One of the things that happens, which is really a catch-22, is when our sleep is compromised, we have an overproliferation of the bad bacteria that drive processed food consumption and that drive high calorie retention. So it is important to deal with the sleep issue as well as the gut food issue at the same time. So interestingly, the research that pointed this out, they first did this with rats, and then they thought, wow, this is so interesting. Even just after one night of compromised sleep, these poor rats were battling in terms of gut bacteria and, the ratio. Then they did it in an observational study with people who were suffering from jet lag. And even one night of compromised sleep affected the gut bacteria balance. So we know that if this continues for a long period of time, then people will immediately start feeling, oh my goodness, something's wrong. What am I going to do? So managing sleep is extremely, extremely important. And one of the ways to kind of like kickstart that is through consuming foods with more magnesium in them. And that's dark green leafy veg, a lot of good prebiotics in them, a lot of good essential fats in them, and also a lot of fiber in them and magnesium. So that's something to do in relation to sleep, which also helps the gut. So that kind of like, deal with one issue or deal with two issues with one strategy. So that's really important. So mothers that wait for the house to be quiet at night so that they can actually sense being alone and enjoying the silence need to keep in mind that they should also consider going to sleep earlier, because that sleep is what their bodies need to heal and what they need to be able to keep their gut bacteria working optimally. So that was point number 3.
Yeah. And, I mentioned before about being able to see the link between the food and what it does for my son's behavior, but sleep is another big one. And I think that's with any child, they get to the end of the day, they haven't had their nap, and, the whole witching hour thing, or, they just have little tolerance for anything. They get emotional, and that's a big thing. But I notice it even in myself. If I've had a late night, or I've had a couple of nights where my littlest has had me up in the middle of the night to put him back off to sleep, I notice it in my own moods. And it's just so essential, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's really important for parents to deal with sleep issues with their children, because the reason the developing brain requires so much sleep is because it's growing at such a rapid pace. So when the child doesn't sleep for the amount of time that they should be sleeping, it actually impacts cognitive development, which means that it'll compromise their intellectual development, which is a challenge. So, and we know this because the developing brain has a very high percentage of melatonin in it, much higher than the adult brain, for this very reason, to prompt the child to sleep more because the brain is growing. And as I said earlier, which is another conversation entirely, those windows of development, you can't, hit replay for them. Yeah. Once those windows of development are passed, the child's brain can no longer go back to, to recapture those moments of development. So it's extremely important to deal with sleep challenges. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that the diet is very, very high in good B vitamins from food, and once again, magnesium, because B6 and magnesium are very important for serotonin synthesis and a whole lot of other things which support children sleeping well. So one of the things that I suggest mothers do is put their children in the bath with a whole lot of magnesium flakes and let them play there with their rubber ducks and all the things that they're playing with, because magnesium is then absorbed transdermally. It doesn't have to go via the gut. and it gets into the bloodstream really efficiently and effectively, and the children should sleep really well because of that.
That's a wonderful tip. And on that as well, is there any merit in the whole no sugar after a certain time in the day? I had a girlfriend tell me once not to give your children sugar after, I think it was lunchtime, and they'll sleep better that way.
Well, once again, this is a complex conversation, but it's like saying, well, have a little bit of cocaine early in the morning, but when you want it late in the day, don't have any. That's not how you break a bad habit. Children's taste buds have to change. And I don't know any child that will be okay with eating lollies at 10 o'clock, and then at 3 o'clock you go, no more lollies. They don't really understand that concept. So what I would suggest parents do is start changing their taste buds, slowly. You don't say to them, we're changing the way we eat in this family.
Well, they're not
today.
going to come to the party, are they? We can say that till the cows come home. It doesn't mean they're going to listen.
Spot on, we can, and they definitely don't listen. So you do it slowly but surely, and then over time they start shifting. The one rule that I stick with in our family: we don't eat any chocolate after 4 p.m. Okay. And that's the rule that we stick with. And it's really, really good chocolate, but we don't eat it after 4 p.m. Not necessarily because it contains even natural sugar, because it contains theobromine, and theobromine is a heart stimulant, and that will stop children from falling asleep late in the day. If though it's full of magnesium, the theobromine will override that. So that is a good rule to have. But as far as sugar goes, any processed sugar will cause blood glucose fluctuations. And those blood glucose fluctuations do a number of negative things in the body. One of the things they do, they actually cause a stress response when they dip, which then causes adrenaline release. And the other thing that they do, they stop the brain from managing emotion effectively. So that is a good reason to shift children from a processed sugar consumption to natural sugar, just to keep blood glucose stable.
Yeah. No, it's crazy as a mum, and this is not coming from a judgmental place at all, but I'm very passionate about it because, you go away and you see all of the foods and everything that are marketed out there to little ones and how much sugar is in them. And, it's through no fault of parents. Like, I think a lot of people are unaware of just how much sugar are in all of the stuff that's marketed as health foods even. And it's quite scary, isn't it? And like you're saying, it does really affect their development and microbiome and all of that.
It's really scary. It's got a very long-reaching effect because their taste buds are developed, and then their brain function is developed, and so is their body physiology. So it's a long-reaching effect. And one of the reasons mothers choose processed foods over more wholesome foods is because they're exhausted. They're tired. They don't want to go and stand in the kitchen in the way they perceive, healthy food to need lots of time and preparation. And that was one of the motivators for putting my recipe book together, because I know that mothers are tired. I've been a mother. A hands-on mother. My children are now older, but I spent time trying to figure out how to make it really simpler and how to make it, you still keep the food tasting delicious and keep them coming back for more, but make sure that I didn't have to spend my life in the kitchen. So that leads me on to my books. I wrote my first book, which is a sciencey book about the brain and brain function. And then I decided to write the recipe book to be able to help mothers and anybody who wants to feed their brain well with delicious and simple recipes. So I basically took the science and put it in the kitchen for people. And I know that my books have been very useful to many, many people, and mothers too, because they realize all the long-term effects that they can influence when they start feeding their children well. So as I mentioned before we started the recording, my publisher has given me permission to share with you a special link. So any viewers or listeners can buy my sciencey book and then get the recipe book for free. And that's a really great offer to get them both and to start working with them.
Thank you so much. And where can our listeners find you? Sorry.
If they can find me on Instagram under Lighter Brighter You, and I put a lot of posts up related to really good and simple to make recipes, firstly, and I also put up a lot of information about the brain and the gut in terms of health. And they can find me on Facebook as well. I've just started a Facebook group for women who feel overwhelmed, stressed, and exhausted. So if they feel an affinity with that feeling and they want to create calm and more energy and not feeling overwhelmed anymore, then they can join me there with pleasure. And I'm also on LinkedIn. If there are any women involved in business and they want to follow my posts there, they can do that as well. So I'm kind of like spread in a number of places. Try not being a social media puppet, but being able to provide good value for people, you know, without only posting about cats and puppies and whatever people post to try and attract attention, but trying to offer really good value.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I will pop links to all of those in my show notes as well, so that our listeners can find you nice and easily. Well, thank you so much for jumping on today, Delia. I really, really appreciate it. And you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I can't wait to get my hands on your recipe book.
I'm sure that you'll enjoy it. One of the top recipes that I actually made was a mistake, and it only requires 2 ingredients, and it tastes like fudge. And I made it when my daughter was really little, and it's a really lovely, yummy product, and it helps wean kids off that really highly processed, sugary taste. So
okay, wonderful. I can't wait to check it out.
And people can, you know, you will enjoy it. And people can also email me if they've got questions. But my social media, you know, presence, I try and give a lot of value in those areas, and of course in my books. And it was a delight to chat to you, Tony. Thank you. And you're doing such important work. Really laying the foundation for future health is priceless.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right.